Hi, everyone. My name is Brian Winterfeld, and I'm co-head of the Global Brand Management Internet practice here at Mayor Brown. Thank you so much for joining our webinar today. Before we get started, I have a few housekeeping announcements. First, as we go along, we're hoping that everyone will ask questions by using the Q&A panel on the right side of your screen. We'll make every effort to answer your questions towards the end of the webinar. If we're not able to get to your question today, we'll be certain to follow up with you directly once the webinar has ended. The second quick housekeeping matter is regarding CLE credits. While approval is pending, we'll be providing an alphanumeric code at some point during the presentation. In order to receive CLE credits, participants must record this code on the virtual sign-in sheet that will be emailed to you with the login instructions for today's program. With those program notes, allow me to introduce our participants today. I'm really excited to introduce our participants. I've already introduced myself. I'm head of Mayor Brown's Global Brand Management and Internet practice. I've been very engaged in ICANN and Internet-related issues for about a decade and have spent my entire practice focusing on the intersection of trademarks and brands. In addition to all of our regular Internet work, we do a full range of trademark portfolio work as well that complements our Internet-specific work. We are also joined today by Brian Beckham. Brian is head of Internet Dispute Resolution Section at WIPO, the World Intellectual Property Organization. We are really excited to have Brian here today. He is responsible for managing day-to-day WIPO's domain name services offered under the WIPO-initiated UDRP and related CCTLD policies. And Brian's going to be sharing with us some of his thoughts on some of the current activities at ICANN that intersect with rights protection mechanisms and the UDRP in particular. We are also joined today by Aparna Sridhar. Aparna is counsel at Google. She represents Google on communications law, communications policy, Internet governance, and Internet policy matters. Aparna regularly participates in ICANN, attending almost all of their meetings, and is an active member of the business constituency. And we're really excited to have her perspective today on a number of important policy issues in the ICANN space. We are also joined today by Todd Williams, who's counsel at Turner Broadcasting System, Inc. Todd handles all digital enforcement, domain name, and anti-counterfeiting matters for Turner's global portfolio of brands, including CNN, TNT, TBS, Cartoon Network, and Adult Swim. Todd also attended the ICANN meeting most recently in Dublin in October and is going to be sharing with us a number of his perspectives on policy issues that are active right now, including coming out of his work as a member of ICANN's GNSO Privacy and Proxy Services Accreditation Issues, or PPSAI, working group that he's been a very active member of. So we have an action-packed agenda today for our hour. We're going to start with a very brief overview of ICANN basics for those of you who are somewhat new to the topic. We're going to then move on to new GTLD program review and implementation issues. We're going to talk about subsequent rounds of new GTLDs. We are going to look at rights protection mechanisms and intellectual property protection in the Internet space and changes that are happening. We're going to look at new GTLD registry agreement negotiations issues, ICANN contractual compliance issues, and we're going to complete the day by talking about IANA stewardship transition and ICANN accountability. Great, so I'm going to do a very brief ICANN overview for those of you who are new to the ICANN space. I think one of the things that makes this space very challenging is that there are a lot of acronyms, and even just ICANN itself and the way it's structured is something that sometimes can be very difficult to penetrate. ICANN is an acronym that stands for Internet Corporation for Assign Names and Numbers. It is a nonprofit based in the state of California that was founded in 1998. It is a global multi-stakeholder organization that collaborates with companies, individuals, and governments to ensure the continued security, stability, and interoperability of the internet. And that's a very fancy way of saying there are lots of parts to the ICANN community that include private individuals, corporations, governments, academics that make up the multi-stakeholder model. And ICANN's mission is really to keep the internet up and running, is what they mean when they say secure, stable, and interoperable. Next slide, please. So what does ICANN do? ICANN has a number of responsibilities. It coordinates internet functions. It makes sure that the internet is secure and stable through a number of different operations. It makes sure that it's interoperable, that there are secure connections that are made between internet users. It also sees part of its mission as stimulating competition and consumer choice. It has accredited over 1,000 registrars, and one of the impetus for the new GTLD program was providing more consumer choice in TLDs. ICANN also makes sure that there's an open and transparent policy development process for subjects that are within its remit, meaning that they really pride themselves on making sure that these processes are very open and there's the ability for all parties in the multi-stakeholder model who are interested to participate in these processes. So a few quick vocabulary words for those of you, again, who are new. There's the registry, the registrar, and the registrant, and these terms can sometimes be a little bit confusing. The registry is the back-end organization that actually runs a TLD or a piece of the internet. A very famous example of a registry is VeriSign, who is the back-end provider for .com and .net. Every person who participated in the new GTLD program actually applied to run a registry. So it's actually a business. The registrar is the entity that sells the second-level domain names, or what's to the left of the dot. So in the examples we have here, you have city.com or mayorbrown.com. If you wanted to register a .com domain name, you don't go to the registry, that's VeriSign. You think of them more as the wholesaler. You actually go to the registrar, which is more like the retailer. So you would go to GoDaddy or web.com, and you would search for citi.com or mayorbrown.com and see if those second-level domains are available, and if they are, you would register them through a registrar. The entity that actually registers the second-level domain name is what's known as the registrant. So, for example, for the example we used previously, mayorbrown.com, the registrant is Mayor Brown LLP, or our law firm. And just a quick lesson on top level versus second level. So what's to the right of dot is the TLD or the top level domain or the first level. So in this example, it's .org. What's to the left of the dot is the second level. And so in this example, it's ICANN is the SLD string. Great, so we're gonna talk a little bit about next about new GTLD program reviews and implementation issues. Aparna, I'm hoping you can jump in and go over some of these with us.
Sure, happy to. So GTLDs, or generic top-level domains, are obviously a big part of the ICANN space. So historically, there were a very small number of generic top-level domains, ones that you are probably familiar with, like .com, .net, .org, .mil. And in the last couple of years, ICANN, after a lot of debate within the community, decided to create a program to allow applicants to create new generic top-level domains. So .bank, .law, .app, .nyc. Applicants put forward their proposals, and they, if accepted, became internet registries. And this process is ongoing. The top-level domains are in the process of being delegated right now. A number are already live. and as this slide makes clear, a number have yet to be delegated. Next slide. So this just provides a timeline, as I said, like the process of discussing and agreeing the policy took a number of years to begin with, and we're now just in the sort of initial stages of deployment and use of the new set of generic names. Can we go to the next slide? So as you can see from this slide, there has been tremendous growth in generic domains, and one of the sort of reasons for opening up the top-level domain space was to allow greater competition in the domain space overall. The idea is that some of the more legacy generic top-level domains did not have a ton of great names left, and so this was a way to increase competition, provide users with flexibility. Next slide, please. Here again are just some more details about the program and the timeline. It's worth noting for those of you who haven't been following the process that the number of applications received, I think, well exceeded anyone's expectations, and so I think a lot of people believe that this process would go more quickly just because there would be not as much interest. Next slide. So even though the rollout of the 2012 round continues, ICANN is reviewing that process and preparing for a second round of new GTLD applications. And I think obviously one of the key or several of the key aspects related to the program reviews are, what do the new rights protection mechanisms adopted for GTLDs provide, and how well have they worked? What are some of the specifics of the program implementation that could be improved? Have we seen any impacts, positive or negative, on security and stability and competition, consumer choice, and consumer trust? I think kind of the two main issues that are being discussed right now that may be of interest to participants on the call are whether or not to have a separate differentiated process for .brands. So if you are a brand owner hoping to use a closed top-level domain, so for example, .google, should that application process look different from one where you're planning to be a registry and offer domains to all comers, and your registry is not sort of per se affiliated with your company or brand? Another key question is whether ICANN is best served with doing the second set of applications as a round, as was done in the first set in 2012, or whether it would make more sense to kind of have a rolling window where you could submit your application whenever you are ready. And so that is, there have been no firm decisions on either of those things, but those are the key issues that people are talking about with respect to a second round.
And Aparna, I'm going to ask you to discuss with us what you think is on the horizon for subsequent next new GTLD rounds, which I know you already started talking about a bit briefly.
Sure. As noted, there are a number of issues that will be addressed with respect to new GTLDs. ICANN is launching a policy development process on this issue, and it's going to cover all of the things that will be addressed in the reviews at a minimum, so rights protection mechanisms, program implementation. And then there are a few new issues that have been raised, including, issues around pricing and marketing practices, issues around contention resolution. So this contention resolution is the idea that two different people or entities have applied for the same top-level string, and how do we allocate between the two, and this has been done through both private auctions and ICANN-led auctions, and so that's another thing that probably merits a review. And finally, as I alluded to, these two issues about should there be a separate category for brands, and kind of what's the process, like does a rolling process in fact kind of work better for everyone than a process where everyone has to put in their applications at the same time, which creates some level of kind of pressure on the system at these given deadlines. Next slide. Here's just some additional detail on the process. I think the most important thing to know is that the PDP will launch in early 2016, probably, but it's not likely to be a very rapid process. I think there will be a significant amount of deliberation, and it makes sense to learn from the lessons of the last round as we go forward. Next slide.
Actually, Aparna, before we go to the next slide, I was wondering if it would be possible for you to share with us what you think are some of the key issues for ICANN to focus on in order to improve the applicant and possibly other stakeholder experiences for round two, given your experiences engaging in round one, both from an applicant and from a policy perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are just a whole host of glitchy things that happened in the first round that are more in the spirit of kind of program implementation that need to be improved, and that's things like, our information shouldn't be released to the public just because we're, inadvertently, which happened a couple times, or the TAS system, which was the system by which you interacted with ICANN, was notoriously buggy. So I think those things are, I don't want to minimize it, those are really important to get fixed and actually are not really policy issues at all, but have had a significant impact on potential participants. And then I think there are a host of kind of policy concerns that we didn't fully anticipate would be hot issues in the first round, that whether or not it is warranted to sort of reconsider the procedures in the applicant guidebook, we ought to at least have a conversation about. So, for example, I think with respect to string similarity, ICANN hasn't handled that issue particularly well. And so what I mean by string similarity is, how do you determine that two strings are similar enough that they ought to sort of go into contention and auction with each other? Car versus cars, it sounds like those are similar enough, but we've had different results on singulars versus plurals, and whether those two are, whether a singular version of a word is confusingly similar to a plural version of a word. That's an example of a substantive issue that I think warrants further consideration. Obviously, the treatment of geographic names that are not currently protected by the applicant guidebook, how do we resolve questions around those and who's allowed to apply for them, what's the role of the Government Advisory Committee in weighing in on those, if any. I think the community as a whole was not prepared to really grapple well with those issues, or did not anticipate how controversial they might be. And so those are a few of the issues. In addition, there's obviously a huge movement by different brand registries to kind of have a special designation, and I think that's something that will be discussed as well.
Great, Aparna. Thank you so much. It's really helpful insights from someone who is very involved in the space, both from an applicant and policy perspective. And I definitely agree with you as someone who helped a lot of clients through the application process and has been involved in the policy development process as well. I think those are some really key issues that are going to need to be straightened out, both in terms of implementation and process for the program, but also from a policy perspective. So one of the key issues, and I think particularly for brand owners, that you highlighted, Aparna, is the review that's going to take place for the rights protection mechanism. I was hoping, Todd, that you could jump in at this point and give us a brief overview of the RPMs for the new GTLD program and discuss how ICANN will be evaluating their use and effectiveness in this review process.
Great, thank you, Brian. So, right, as part of the new GTLD program, there were certain new rights protection mechanisms that brand owners could take advantage of to deal with the new scale that the new GTLDs presented in terms of defensive registrations or enforcement, et cetera. And so the slide outlines them, the first one being the Trademark Clearinghouse, which was a centralized clearinghouse or database of verified trademarks that's managed by Deloitte, and essentially streamlines the process for having your mark verified in terms of what you need to submit for your registration information, your proof of use, et cetera. So rather than having to do it each time a new GTLD comes out, you can do it through the TMCH and then it's already done. That, in turn, is related to two other new RPMs, the Sunrise and Claims. So the Sunrise is essentially just a period of first dibs or first priority for a trademark owner to register a domain in a new GTLD before it's made available to the public. The specifics may vary by the registry in terms of whether it's an end date Sunrise or a start date Sunrise, the pricing, et cetera. But the general idea is that it's a short period of first availability for trademark owners. And then the Claims, that represents a notice that goes to potential registrants, which basically just tells them the domain name that you're attempting to register matches something that's in the TMCH. Upon receiving that, they have to acknowledge the rights of the trademark owner before then completing the registration. If they do that, there's a second notice that goes out to the owner of the mark that's in the TMCH. That has two important limitations on it that are baked into the TMCH itself, which we'll talk about a little bit more on the next slide. But that's one, it's limited to exact matches for the trademark. Now, there's a minor exception to that for what are called abused labels, but it's basically just the trademark itself. And then the second is that that claims period only runs for the first 90 days. So it's short in terms of the duration of when these claims notices are going to go out. But those were the big new RPMs that were included as part of the new GTLD program kind of on the front end. And then on the back end, the big one was what's called the URS, which is intended to be a quicker, lower cost alternative to the UDRP for enforcement against domain names that are squatting on a mark. Quicker in the sense of being resolved in a matter of weeks as opposed to months. Cheaper in the sense of costing several $100s as opposed to several thousand. That said, it has two limitations relative to the UDRP that are significant. One being that the remedy is limited. It does not include transfer of the offending domain to the trademark owner. Rather, it's simply suspension for the remainder of the registration period. And the second being that the standard is higher and is clear and convincing evidence, and that's intentional because it's a, like I said, quicker process. So when you look at kind of statistics as to how that's been used relative to the UDRP just in the time that it's been available, it really hasn't been utilized that much by brand owners, and that's something that some of these reviews that we're talking about are going to take a look at. There's also a bullet point here about, for example, blocking services. These are not, unlike the others that we just talked about, mandatory as part of the new TLD program, but they are certain services that some of the new registries have offered to brand owners. So one of the more well-known ones is the DPML that's offered by Donuts. So essentially, for one price, you can get a block of your trademark in, all of the different new GTLDs that are going to be offered by that particular registry. Now, there's some limitations as to the utility of that. One, it's not entirely clear because some of these contention sets are still ongoing, what exactly is going to be included in that bundle. And two, some of those new GTLDs may be more or less relevant to you depending on your industry, et cetera. But that's the idea behind it, right? It's you're buying in bulk and therefore getting a discount because of it. So that's kind of where we are. But one of the important notes, certainly for everybody on this call, is that these are all about to be reviewed by ICANN, and most specifically on this last bullet point, there is a new PDP that's coming. Where we are in the posture, the preliminary issue report went out for public comment. The public comment period literally just ended November 30th, so very recently. And so now it's going to go back to staff, which will issue a final report to the GNSO. But basically, a PDP is coming, going to start next year, presumably, to look at all of these RPMs and their effectiveness, and do they need to be changed, and if so, how? And one of the questions that was certainly highlighted in that preliminary issue report and that a lot of the public comments focused on was, to what extent does the UDRP, which is something that's been around many, many years and certainly predates a lot of these new ones, need to be included within that review. So certainly for brand owners and brand owners who take advantage of the UDRP as part of one of the tools in their enforcement arsenal, this is definitely a PDP to keep an eye on and keep in mind. And that's actually a good transition to the next slide, which highlights some of the issues that it may look at. So the first one, applicability of the new GTLD RPMs to legacy TLDs. So this is kind of going the other way, taking something like the URS, for example, and saying, should this apply to legacy GTLDs such as .com? We've seen a little bit of discussion on this just in terms of some legacy TLDs adopting some of these new GTLD RPMs kind of on their own as part of their contract renewals, but as a policy matter, should it extend back to legacy GTLDs, certainly an issue that's going to be on top of everybody's mind. Improving the URS, I mentioned that. Are there changes to the remedy that could make it more useful and essentially incentivize brand owners to use it more than they have in the time that it's been available so far? We talked about the extent to which the UDRP will be included in this broader review, and if so, what exactly is that going to look like? Certainly there's improvements to the UDRP that we can think about, and some of them are included here, but by the same token, it is a remedy that has been largely effective for brand owners over the years, and so is it a question of in trying to improve it, do you risk potentially losing some of the good points that you've been taking advantage of historically? Pricing and marketing practices that circumvent RPMs. I said before that when you look at something like Sunrise, for example, the pricing is going to vary by new GTLD registry to the extent that some have used that to essentially circumvent the purpose of the RPM or make it cross-prohibitive, et cetera. Is that something that can be addressed through this policy development process? And then the last one is the point that I made earlier about expanding the TMCH to protect beyond simply exact matches, and we've included some examples here, perhaps mark plus keyword, common typographical errors, et cetera, again, to make it more useful, really, and more effective at serving the purpose that it was intended to serve.
Great, Todd. Thank you so much. That was an excellent overview of the RPMs. I think you did a really good job of covering some of the priority issues for brand owners to be thinking about during this review process. I wanted to ask you a quick question. As a brand owner, how has your experience with domain name enforcement changed as a result of the new GTLD program, or has it yet?
No, it's a great question. And the analogy that I always use in discussing it is, the main change has been to our defensive registration approach or strategy, and the way to think about it is that defensive registrations are really insurance, right? Historically, you defensively registered a domain that included your mark as a way of paying a little bit of money now to avoid having to pay a lot of money later, in the sense of, okay, now somebody's squatting on it and we need to go pursue it, whether that be through a UDRP or something else. With the introduction of the new GTLDs, that insurance equation has changed on both sides. So the cost of the premium on the front end has gone up because there's just so many more GTLDs that you would need to defensively register in, plus they're more expensive for the most part than historical GTLDs. Whereas your cost on the back end of the thing that you are attempting to insure against has gone down somewhat given the availability of the URF. Now, I said before the URF is a kind of limited RPM, but it's still something, and so that equation has changed a lot significantly. And so what that means is we just need to be smarter about how we spend our insurance money, basically. And you don't want to spend a ton of money on flood insurance if you don't live anywhere near the water, right? And so rather than trying to defensively register across the board, taking a much more strategic look at, okay, which of these new GTLDs are most relevant to our business model, to our brands, where do we want to be aggressive versus where can we take a step back, because you just cannot cover everything the way that you could in the old days, before the new GTLD rollout. And the statistics have borne that out. I mean, if you look at statistics for registrations in .NET, for example, which I think was historically something that most people looked at as a defensive registration that you got when you also got your .com, those have gone down. And I think it's because brand owners are being more strategic and selective in where they're spending their insurance, basically.
Great, Todd. I think that's excellent advice, and it really lines up with a lot of the work that we've done with our clients over the past year or so, really helping them kind of reconfigure their enforcement strategies. And I think you're right in a lot of ways when you have 700 plus generic spaces instead of just 23 before, and really frankly a huge focus on just .com. You have to learn to be much more selective, have thicker skin as far as going after the kinds of infringement that are really damaging your brand or diverting traffic in a real way, or taking sales from your company. If a website's not resolving, maybe you just want to monitor it and maybe not go after it unless it's a really key domain that your business client needs. So I think that's really helpful advice. We're actually going to be doing our next webinar most likely on thinking about brand enforcement in 2016, early next year. So we may be asking you to come back and continue sharing your insights, but that was really helpful. Brian Beckham, as an administrator of rights protection mechanisms, namely the UDRP with WIPO, I'm hoping you could share with us a little bit about what impact, if any, the new GTLD program has had on WIPO. And I'm really interested also in hearing what aspects of the current RPM system you think are important to review, and what also you might think should be just left alone, that it's fine the way it is.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. I think, in a word, what the new GTLD program has meant for us at WIPO is more work. We have seen in 2015 so far, around 15% of our caseload involves new GTLDs. So usually we have just shy of 3,000 cases per year. That sort of edges up a few hundred since about 2009 when there was the global economic downturn. But we tend to see a modest increase in cases every year. And beginning in 2014 with the first new GTLDs launching and second level domain name registrations being available, we started to see UDRP cases under the UDRP with new GTLDs. It was about half the percentage in 2014 as we have in 2015. So obviously with some of the more popular contested strings starting to launch and some yet to launch, we expect that trend to continue to increase. So we expect more cases and more work on our end. Of course, we look at that from a policy perspective as well. In terms of the actual cases, initially what we were seeing were cases where it was because, as Todd mentioned, you had the availability of the Trademark Clearinghouse and Sunrises, so brand owners could preemptively buy that insurance. For a lot of brand owners, they opted not to because as Aparna mentioned, we weren't entirely sure how many of these new GTLDs were going to be applied for in the beginning. I remember in the early days, people were throwing out numbers 50 to 100, then it became 200 to 300, and then suddenly we had almost 2,000 applications. So I think in large part, brands were a bit shell-shocked when they saw the numbers of new GTLDs that were applied for, and they took the conscious decision not to buy the name in Sunrise in every new GTLD. Obviously, the flip side of that was that if the name was registered and put to an infringing use, then they had the choice to make on a follow-on action, and in some cases that led to a UDRP case. So in the early UDRP cases, what we saw were exact matches to a brand .new GTLD. So it could be, city.bank or city.web, something like this. And that still is the predominant trend. So it's an exact match. We haven't seen, as far as I'm aware, any typos of brands in new GTLDs. Brand owners are really being selective about what they're enforcing in new GTLDs. From those early days, though, we're starting in the course of this year to see TLDs where the actual string corresponds to the goods or services that the brand owner operates under. So some of those could be financial services, for example, holdings, I believe there was, I can't remember the name of the company, but some financial industry company, holdings. So it was the trademark actually what's called spans the dot. So it's the brand plus the words after the dot that comprise the entire mark. So we saw some of those spanning the dot brands plus the goods and services in the TLD as emerging cases. And more recently, we've started to see a few cases, and this is particularly in, let's say, the more high-risk areas like the pharmaceuticals or luxury goods, where brand owners are starting to look at filing UDRP cases under new GTLDs, where there's the brand name plus keyword plus a new GTLD. So it could be, Viagra drug.web or something like this. So it's still predominantly brand, not .new GTLD, so exact matches, but we're starting to see brand owners take a little bit of a looser or more cautious approach in terms of what they're chasing after in new GTLDs. You mentioned in terms of the review, what is it that we believe would be important to review or fix or leave alone? I think one of the big questions is, of course, ICANN has now formally launched a policy development process by issuing what they call an issue report or a preliminary issue report. But I think people are largely jumping from the question of whether to review the UDRP to whether to reform the UDRP. And I think Todd really hit the nail on the head earlier when he said, obviously there are questions, and you see them on the slides, whether there should be a loser pay system or change the registration and use requirement to an or requirement. It's not to say that the UDRP is perfect or it can't be fixed, but the question really is, are there trade-offs that will become necessary in the ICANN process that would ultimately not be worth rolling the dice on? And it's really looking into the crystal ball. No one can tell for certain whether the UDRP review would be a net gain for brand owners or not. Obviously, being the organization that birthed the UDRP, WIPO's taking a keen interest in ICANN's policy process. We submitted comments on ICANN's preliminary issue reports already, and we urged extreme caution. It's a case of, my boss likes to use the analogy of trying to change the oil in a car while you're driving down the expressway. The UDRP, it's been running for 15 years. There's a lot of case law developed around it. We produce a jurisprudential overview. Of course, it's not perfect. Of course, it can be improved, but the question is, what are the trade-offs that may become necessary? I think that leads me to the bigger question, which is one of the other rights protection mechanisms that ICANN is looking at is the URS. And during the policy development process for new GTLDs, I think it's fair to say that maybe not enough attention was given to the relationship between the URS and the UDRP. Should the UDRP be, in effect, an appeal from an unsuccessful URS case? Should they be completely distinct? So I think that's one of the key questions. If people are going to be, for example, asking for a transfer remedy under the URS, what does that mean for the UDRP? You know, should the transfer remedy under the URS really be only for defended cases if there's no defense, which in UDRP cases historically around 75% of the respondents don't bother to defend the case? We've asked the question, should that operate more like a DMCA type model where if there's no response, then the name is suspended automatically based on that default, and if there's a response, then it's kicked over to a panel to make a reasoned decision. So these are some of the questions that we think are appropriate to be asking in the ICANN review process.
Thank you, Brian. That's super helpful. It's really great, and I would encourage anyone who's interested in this to, you know, read WIPO's comments that they did place on the initial report on the RPM review that fleshes out even more of what Brian talked about today. That's great. So I think we're going to transition now from RPMs to talk about new GTLD registry agreement negotiations. Brian, I'm actually going to ask you to, because of your involvement historically in that, to give us a little bit of the background on the ICANN registry agreement negotiations and kind of how those played out.
Yeah, they played out over the course of about a year and a half, and the bottom line was ICANN, when you applied for one of these new GTLDs, you had to sign a contract to become a registry operator to have your TLD delegated into the root zone. And ICANN initially took a one-size-fits-all approach. So whether you were applying for .web and proposing to sell second-level registrations on a first-come, first-served basis to the general public, or whether you were a .city, for example, .New York for .NYC, and you wanted to limit that space to New Yorkers, or whether you were a .brand, for example, .hsbc or .yahoo, and you wanted to limit that space to your own use, we raised the question whether it was appropriate to have that one-size-fits-all contract when some of the considerations for a generic space where there's third-party rights involved. So if you're selling domain names to the general public, obviously there's a follow-on effect where you're contracting with registrars, the registrars are contracting with registrants. It's important to, you know, clarify what are the rights and responsibilities of those parties in that chain. But where you were effectively the only party in the chain, we asked whether it was necessary to have all of these different considerations that were in the generic contract. So we conducted a process with ICANN that led to what was called Specification 13, or the .brand contract. That process began with a request of about 35 or 40 line item changes to the contract, and for the most part, ICANN didn't accept a lot of those, and we understood the reasons for those. We had a pretty good and open negotiation with them. Ultimately, they did come around to some of the key requests, which were in effect that the brand owner who was operating the .brand could choose its partners. Under the normal contract, you mentioned earlier, Brian, increasing competition and the number of registrars and the number of registries. Under the normal contract, as a registry, you were obliged to open up your registry for any registrar to sell to any third party. And with the .brand contract, we were able to get an agreement from ICANN that you could limit the parties that you would actually contract with and sell names to, so you control that space. And that really fits with the model and the purpose for applying for a .brand TLD, which is you control the secure space. It also had some provisions for if you ever were to wind down the TLD, because obviously this is an application that's coming on the back of a trademark registration on an existing business, on the reputation and goodwill that comes along with that. and we thought it was important that if you chose for some reason to wind down your registry operations, that ICANN wouldn't redelegate that string to a third party without giving appropriate consideration to your trademark rights. And of course, I understand from that point, there have been some more recent negotiations, Brian, that maybe you've been involved with.
Thanks, Brian. Yeah, so there are a couple points. I think, first of all, as Aparna mentioned previously, there is some indication of the brand owner community looking for maybe more special provisions for them in subsequent new GTLD rounds, or even there's been talk of having a subsequent round that's really dedicated just to .brands. And I think, looking carefully at the registry agreement and maybe thinking about other issues that might be relevant for brand owners to ask about are something that we should all be contemplating right now and considering giving our feedback on. In addition, as you alluded to, Brian, there are currently additional negotiations going on with the registry stakeholder group on behalf of all GTLDs that have been delegated to perhaps make some additional changes to the base registry agreement. Some of those are added here. Because of time, we're not going to go into those, but I encourage folks who are interested to, read through the contents of slide 28, and, please feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions about those current negotiations or thoughts or suggestions on additional changes you'd like to see to the registry agreement, either in general or specifically to .brands. So now I think we are going to transition to a very hot topic in Dublin that started before Dublin and will continue on, which is ICANN Contractual Compliance. And I'm hoping that Todd, you can jump in and go over some of the current issues that you have been very engaged with. And I'm also hoping that Aparna will be able to jump in and provide some additional insights from her participation and her perspective regarding compliance matters after you finish your overview.
Great, thanks, Brian. And I'll go quickly because I know we're short on time. There's two big issues that are noted on this slide, and I'll actually start with the second one, which is at the bottom. The ICANN Working Group on Privacy Proxy Accreditation just this week finalized its final report, which is going to be sent to the GNSO Council, and then presumably will go from there to various kind of implementation type issues. But basically what this is a 2-year-long process to come up with accreditation standards for privacy and proxy services. And what those are, real quick for anybody who doesn't know, when I go to register a domain, my information is included in the public who is. To the extent that I want to pay somebody to substitute their contact information for mine while keeping my name as the registrant, that is a privacy service. To the extent that I want to pay somebody to substitute their name and contact information for mine, that is a proxy service. And these have been largely unaccredited up until this point, but this working group put together a very long report on what those services will need to do to be accredited by ICANN. For brand owners, the most relevant part of that, I would argue, is the annex to the final report, which outlines an illustrative disclosure framework, which basically says when you, brand owner, submit notice to a privacy proxy service that somebody using their service is infringing on your trademark or copyright, and you have certain prima facie elements that you've proven. What happens? What do you have to show? What at that point is the obligation of the privacy proxy provider to reply to you, et cetera. And this was a very debated topic. Obviously, there's a lot of different competing interests that are at play here. There's the brand owner's interest in minimizing what is basically a negative externality of this contract, the increased cost of enforcement because you don't know who it is that's operating this domain, but it has to be weighed against the interests of the privacy and proxy providers in having a sustainable business model, and the interests of the registrants in keeping their privacy, which in many, many cases is a certainly legitimate interest. And I think this final report does a very good job of balancing all three of those, but I would certainly encourage anybody who's interested to go take a look at it and then follow the process as it moves forward, because I do think this is going to represent a shift in kind of what you need to do as part of your enforcement when dealing with proxy services. So that's point one. The other point is, and this was really a hot topic at Dublin, was on specifically 3.18 of the 2013 RAA, which requires registrars to maintain an abuse contact to receive reports of abuse, including reports of illegal activity, and then take reasonable and prompt steps to investigate and respond appropriately to those reports. Illegal activity is a defined term in the RAA, but that second part, reasonable and prompt steps to investigate and respond appropriately to any reports of abuse, is subject to interpretation, and that is really where the focus is now. ICANN's compliance has put out a series of blog posts as to what that term might mean. As the slide notes, there are kind of ongoing discussions about voluntary best practices, which may be relevant to the interpretation of that term, but that is really the main topic of compliance, at least in the discussions in Dublin. And I think with that, I'll turn it over.
Great. Aparna, do you have any thoughts to share on these ongoing efforts right now?
No, I mean, I think really the key piece of it is that there is this language in the RAA that talks about reasonable and prompt steps to investigate and respond, and kind of what the contours of that obligation are is a very live discussion at the moment.
Great. Well, thank you, Todd, for that quick but very helpful overview. And again, I think this is definitely one of the hot topics that I think brand owners and content owners should really be paying attention to moving forward, and that will continue to be an issue very likely at the Marrakesh meeting next year. I'd like to transition to our last topic for the day, which is actually the planned transition of the IANA function, or the Internet Assigned Numbers Authority, from the U.S. Department of Commerce to a global stakeholder community. This is something that was started by ICANN in its announcement actually last year in 2014, and has continued to be a significant hot topic and a huge source of multiple streams of work that are going on right now. Aparna, I'm hoping you can give us kind of a quick overview of the key IANA issues that are happening right now, and just some very top-level thoughts you think that would be important for our audience to keep in mind with regard to this issue.
Sure. So if folks are already familiar, and NTIA has historically had a contractual relationship with ICANN to operate what are called the IANA functions, the Internet Assigned Numbers Authority functions. And this contract provides NTIA with a certain amount of oversight and leverage with respect to ICANN, and many people feel that it's an important backstop to ensuring that ICANN remains accountable. On the other hand, it's been a real thorn in the side of governmental stakeholders who believe that the United States sees itself as a first among equals in the governmental context, and is supportive of the multi-stakeholder model so long as they continue to have this contractual leverage. So in order to kind of dispel some of those myths and really kind of show its ongoing commitment to the multi-stakeholder model, NTIA has asked stakeholders to put together a transition plan that would essentially sunset that contract. That process is now well underway. There is a cross-community working group of stakeholders from all of the different communities within the ICANN ecosystem who have put together a third draft report. It's a very long report with a tremendous amount of information. But I think, you know, there are kind of key improvements in that report which will have to be sent to the board. The board will approve it and then send it to NTIA. All of these accountability improvements are a sort of parallel but important part of the transition process. The transition process will not go forward without the accountability improvements. And so this slide contains a number of the kind of elements of the proposal, but most importantly, you know, ICANN's mission is going to be affirmed to be limited. There are going to be some enhancements to the independent review panel process. And generally, there is going to be sort of an improvement to the accountability of the ICANN board to the ICANN community. So, for example, by allowing individual board members to be recalled by the groups that have appointed them. There's a lot of discussion happening right now, and the deadline for responding to the third draft is the 21st, and we expect the proposal will likely to move toward finalization in early next year. Yeah, so this slide basically covers a number of the other elements, but the timeline more or less is that the charting organizations will approve the third draft later this month into early next month. It will go to the board, then it will go from the board to NTIA in parallel with the IANA stewardship transition proposal, which has more to do with how the functions will actually be performed in the absence of a contract.
Thanks so much, Aparna. I think this was super helpful. Todd, just very quickly, could you tell our audience why this Iono transition is a topic that brand owners really should be paying attention to?
Yes, several reasons, but the main one being that a lot of what is being talked about in terms of the enhanced accountability, which is itself part of the transition, is related to the compliance issues that we were just talking about. So I would specifically kind of encourage everybody on this call who is interested to look at Annex 5 of that third draft report that just came out and is now available for public comment until the 21st, because that outlines some of the changes in the language that have occurred from the existing bylaws to the second draft report to what is now the third draft report, and how that language has been negotiated, but mainly wants to ensure that the intellectual property interests want to ensure that ICANN still has the ability to enforce its contracts relative to the compliance issue that we were just talking about.
Great, Todd. Thank you so much. I think that is super helpful, and I completely agree with you. I think that there are broader implications for brand owners as well, in the fact that keeping ICANN accountable and making sure that there's a mechanism to make sure that the CEO and the board feels like it has meaningful oversight to kind of provide a check and balance is something that's important to the whole institution running smoothly, which directly relates, I think, to making sure the policy development process and the implementation of those policies continues to be done in a way that's as favorable as possible to brand owners. Well, we are actually out of time, so unfortunately we don't have time to cover anyone's questions. Again, today we really cover what we think are the hot topics that really came forward in Dublin in October at the last ICANN meeting. The next ICANN meeting is going to take place in Marrakesh, Morocco in March from the 5th to the 10th. And we expect that many of these same issues are going to be the ones that are going to remain as key issues moving forward, but we hope you found today's overview very helpful. If you have additional questions, please feel free to email Jeremy at jfegley@mayorbrown.com, jfegley@mayorbrown.com, and he'll make sure that the questions get forwarded to the team. You can also feel free to email me at bwinterfeld@mayorbrown.com, and I'll make sure the questions get circulated as well. Or if you just have any other general questions about ICANN or participation in any of the issues that we talked about, I'm available at any time to chat with you about that. So thank you so much for joining us today, and we look forward to having you participate in future Mayor Brown webinars.